Racker and Heimann on countertransference, similarities and differences. How countertransference became a therapeutic tool. Part 1. Both Sigmund Freud and Melanie Klein recognized the existence of countertransference, but distrusted its clinical use. This idea was the one that prevailed until the late 1940s, when Heinrich Racker in Buenos Aires and Paula Heimann in London played decisive roles in reinstating countertransference. More specifically, both Racker in 1948 and Heimann in 1949, independently of and without contact with each other, claimed the importance of countertransference for signifying the transference and unconscious processes that the patient reenacts in the analytic relationship. The context in which their ideas were developed allows us to recognize differences within their common view of countertransference as a useful tool in psychoanalytic work. In this article, we present the development of both Racker's and Heimann's ideas on countertransference and attempt a comparison of similarities and differences of those ideas and put them into a historical and clinical theoretical context. Introduction. A purely intellectual interpretation of symbolic meanings of dreams and other symbols began to be undermined with the publication of Freud's Dora case in 1899. It was further compromised by Ferenczi when he promoted the investigation of the more intimate emotional connections between analyst and patients. Marjorie Brearley, 1937, said, "It is time that we restored effects to a place in theory more consonant with their importance in practice." p. 257. The Balance, after taking refuge in Britain, began to re-examine the countertransference. The analytical situation is the result of an interplay between the patient's transference and the analyst's countertransference, complicated by the reactions released in each by the other's transference onto him. Ballant and Ballant, 1939, page 228. These early signals developed into a major rethinking of countertransference in the late 1940s. Indeed, it is possible to distinguish two periods in the history of this concept, a first stage that goes from 1909 until the end of the 1940s, period in which the countertransference was perceived as resistance/obstacle that should be avoided or eliminated, and then a second stage in which the countertransference is perceived as a useful diagnostic/therapeutic tool. Dagful 2013, see also Hinshelwood 2016, Stefana 2017a, Stefana et al. 2020. The works by Heinrich Racker and Paula Heimann, the two most quoted figures of that rethinking, bridged the interval between these two periods. In this article, we want to disentangle the contributions of Racker and Heimann, who are so frequently thought together. See, for example, Abend 2018, Berkhofer 2017, Christian 2015, Levy 2017. Perelberg 2016, Skogstad 2015, Weiss 2018. Therefore, we will present Racker's and Heimann's ideas, then attempt a comparison of their similarities, differences, and interactions, and put them into a historical and clinical theoretical context. Alberto Stefana works as a psychotherapist at the psychiatric unit of the Spedali Civili Hospital of Brescia and in private practice in Brescia, Italy, and as a post-doctoral researcher at the University of Brescia. He has researched and written extensively on object relations psychoanalysis, psychiatry, clinical psychology, and psychotherapy. Robert D. Hinshelwood is a fellow of the British Psychoanalytical Society and was director of the Castle Hospital. He is professor emeritus at the University of Essex, UK. He has written extensively on Kleinian psychoanalysis and on its relevance to understanding the dynamics of organizations. Claudia Lucia Borensztejn is a medical doctor and psychoanalyst and is the current president of the Argentine Psychoanalytic Association, as well as the editor of the Diccionario de Psicoanálisis Argentino, 2015. Circulation of Kleinian ideas from London to Buenos Aires in the 1940-1950s. The work of Racker and Heimann coincided with the arrival of psychoanalysis in Argentina, and contacts were made with the British Society. In 1942, the Asociación Psicoanalítica Argentina, APA, was founded, and straightaway its official organ, the Revista de Psychoanálisis, published in Spanish translation articles of Melanie Klein and her collaborators, including Susan Isaacs and Joan Riviere. This publishing choice anticipated the interest in the Kleinian movement in the region of Rio de la Plata during the years between 1950 and 1970. See Lisman Pieksansky and Pieksansky 2015. Personal contact between Argentinian analysts and the Klein group started with the 1949 International Congress of Psychoanalysis in Zurich, when the APA was recognized as a component society of the IPA, and importantly when Heimann presented her paper on countertransference. Subsequently, in the 1950s, Argentinian analysts established close ties to the British psychoanalytic community, especially with Klein, Heimann, and Rosenfeld. In fact, a journey to Buenos Aires was planned for Klein and Heimann in the early 1950s. Letter from Klein to Betty Garma and Arminda Aberasturi, June 25, 1952. Garma, born in 2003. But it was later cancelled because of the contention between Klein and Heimann. Garma, 1992, instead, Klein sent Hannah Siegel as a leading exponent to supervise and teach in 1954, a visit that was regarded as a true scientific event. Echegoyen and Zisman, 2005, page 874. Racker himself went to London in 1955, and during supervisions he recorded Klein's comments to share with his Argentine colleagues. Cizio, 1985. Back in Argentina, Racker may have gained some knowledge of Heimann's work before presenting his second paper on countertransference, a contribution to the psychoanalysis of transference neurosis, 1950, which, as we will see later, marked the dominant trend that characterized Racker's future research, countertransference as a technical tool, a perspective that has become widely accepted in recent years. See, for example, the panel, Metaphors and the Use of Analyst as Tools to Improve Our Clinical Practice of the IPA Congress, Boston, 2015. Heinrich Racker. Heinrich Racker, 19101961, was born in Poland and earned his doctorate in philosophy and music in 1935 in Vienna. He began to fulfill his dream of being a psychoanalyst. Racker, quoted in Echegoyen 2014, page 90, in 1936, when he started a training analysis with Jean Lampold Groot, analyzed by Freud. Racker was unable to complete his training after Nazi Germany's annex of Austria in 1938. He emigrated to Argentina, arriving in Buenos Aires in 1939. He entered analysis with the Spaniard Angel Garma, analyzed by Theodore Rake, but he soon had to interrupt for financial constraints. Finally, in 1942, Racker began a training analysis with the Viennese, Marie Langer, analyzed by Sturba, and in the following year, began the Institute's seminars, becoming an associate member of the APA in 1947, then a full member in 1950 and a training analyst the following year. In September 1948, Ranker presented the paper, A Contribution to the Problem of Countertransference, to a gathering limited to the training analysts of the APA. This work elicited various disagreements from those present, and one important analyst said haughtily that the best thing for an analyst to whom those things happened was for him to reanalyze himself. Echegoyen, 1986, page 265. Such negative welcome did not hold Racker back from developing a general theory of countertransference, on which he continued to work until his death. In this first presentation, Racker, 1953-1948, already recognized the countertransference, defined as the entirety of images, feelings, and impulses towards the patient, as an important tool for analytic practice. More specifically, he maintained that the countertransference is instrumental in bringing to the analysts notice a psychological fact about the patient, page 323, and it allows him to identify intellectually with the patient's ego and potentially to understand it. Later, he will call this a concordant countertransference. However, because of his own neurosis, sometimes the analyst is not able to identify emotionally and react with understanding. This will only be possible after analysis of the analyst's issue. Moreover, even when the working through process succeeds, the analyst may sometimes still be disturbed by what he has understood. Then his own interpretative capacity may be compromised. Later, Racker explained that in this case the analyst identifies himself with the patient's internal objects, a type of identification he called complementary countertransference. This presentation was published in the International Journal in 1953, but references to articles on countertransference which appear in the intervening 5 years were consigned to footnotes. Hence, in Argentina, Racker is considered the pioneer in this subject. This pioneering work was probably the most Freudian of his contributions. Racker, as a Viennese analyst, was prudent in approaching countertransference from the point of view of the analyst's psychopathology. However, he was bold in opening a discussion on the analyst's Oedipus complex. The original neurosis, the transference neurosis, and the countertransference neurosis are all centered on unresolved Oedipal issues. However, the analyst's neurosis was not exposed in detail, probably because at that time almost all analysts were reluctant to expose their own neuroses. Nonetheless, Racker had started to undertake a kind of analysis of the analyst, elucidating psychological mechanisms based on Klein's and Enrique Pichon Riviere's object relations theories, Scharf 2018. Racker's fundamental hypothesis was that as the whole of the patient's personality, the healthy part and the neurotic part, his present and past, reality and fantasy, are brought into play in his relation with the analyst, so it is with the analyst, although with qualitative and quantitative differences in his relation with the patient. 1953-1948, page 313. In other words, the analyst's neurotic issues are the basis for his pathological response to the patient's transference neurosis. The transference, countertransference neurosis is always present with greater or lesser intensity, and, in becoming aware of the countertransference, he can sense what is happening in the patient. The countertransference neurosis is a pitfall to the analyst's understanding. Given the analyst's double role of interpreter of and object of the unconscious processes, the countertransference can distort or prevent his perception. However, even a correct perception can evoke neurotic reactions, compromising one's interpretive capacity. Moreover, if the countertransference remains unconscious, it negatively affects the analyst's understanding and interpretation as well as his behavior towards the patient, and thus causes a change in the patient's internal image of the analyst. So, the countertransference also influences the patient and his transference. This view can be traced back to Ferenczi, 1918, Ferenczi and Rank 1924, whose influences are discernible in Racker. In the countertransferential situation, the objects, or rather, the parents of the genital Oedipus complex and their heir, the superego, Racker 1958b 1956, page 556, can be transferred onto the patient in a direct way or an indirect one. In other words, the clinician experiences a direct countertransference when the object, upon which the countertransference depends, is the patient who comes to represent the parent. Alternatively, an indirect countertransference is when the object is, for example, a colleague with whom one discusses the case and from whom one desires some sort of appreciation. Usually, both of these forms of countertransference appear, although to different degrees, during the course of the analytic process. Perhaps, Racker being an excellent pianist, his great musical sensitivity enhanced his perception and theorization of the need to be a sensitive passive instrument, and a rational critical listener, Racker 1960-1957. Page 131 in the Spanish version, only, point 1. Between 1949 to 1952, Racker proceeded to an extensive study of transference neurosis, its relationship with resistance, and its role in the analytic process, producing 4 papers. In his paper, A Contribution to the Psychoanalysis of Transference Neurosis, Racker in summary said, "The analyst's perception of his own countertransference states could prove an important instrument for the understanding of the analysand's transference states. If the analyst can use his negative countertransference reactions in favor of the treatment, he is usually able to overcome them." When does negative countertransference appear? In general terms, it could be said that it is the result of the analyst feeling that the analysand has frustrated him. In this sense, we could claim, although it may only be partly accurate, that whenever the analyst is angry, the analysand has a feeling of guilt about his transference aggressiveness. To put this in the terms of the present paper, whenever the analyst experiences anger, the analysand is defending himself from the basic paranoid situation, which is being transferred in a latent fashion by means of the identification with the bad object, that is, the frustrating object. Deep down, what has been projected onto the analyst is a persecutor. On the surface, it is the superego that reproaches him for his tendencies, or behavior, that correspond to the aforementioned identification. Racker 1961-1950, p. 239n. Dealing with the annoyance/anger aroused in the analyst by the patient's resistance to the analysis, Racker concluded that it is not only or not so much an objective response to the frustration of her own efforts, but also a paranoid countertransferential reaction triggered by, and therefore revealing, the existence in the patient of feelings of aggression and anxiety elicited by specific relationships with the patient's, internal objects. Therefore, at least in part, the sense of inconvenience/annoyance/anger the analyst feels in the face of the patient's resistances is infantile in nature and can never be fully avoided. Here, according to Echegoyen, 2014, Racker's approach is truly revolutionary, page 88. According to Racker's stratification hypothesis, in each of the libidinal stages there is a paranoid situation, which had its origin in an actual lack, resulting from a frustrating libidinal object that is experienced as a persecutor. And every libidinal link feels dangerous, that is the persistent danger of being frustrated or attacked. The patient's guilty feelings and paranoid fear of retaliation/abandonment by the analyst refer to the projection of both the ID and a part of the bad ego, consisting of bad objects with which the analysand identified himself in an attempt to defend against their persecution, upon the analyst. Such a projection occurs together with the identification of the superego with the internal persecutors. This second lecture, too, received a negative response at the time from most of Racker's APA colleagues, few of whom considered either paper a major contribution to psychoanalysis, Cesio 1985. However, the situation radically changed within the next few years. Between 1949 and 1956, the International Journal was particularly interested in countertransference and published a series of articles by Winnicott, 1949, Heimann, Little, 1951, Racker, and others. That is why, when Racker gave his third lecture on countertransference at the APA in 1951, he was no longer alone and no longer a transgressor. He was a young training analyst whose research was aligned with a growing number of European and American theorists who were accepting that the countertransference is a technical tool that can reveal something about the analysand's psychological processes. Furthermore, between 1949 to 1958, he also explored the transference neurosis and the stratification of neuroses in general, reaching the conclusion that transference and countertransference are inextricably interwoven and in part reciprocally determined. Therefore, in his works he does not speak just of countertransference neurosis, but of the dynamics of countertransference reactions, and counter-resistances. Thus, in September of 1951, Racker presented Observations on Countertransference as a Technical Instrument, Preliminary Communication at the APA. In this work, Racker, 1952-1951 cited and agreed with Heimann, maintaining that the content of the countertransference reaction can teach us about the content of the transference situation P. 22. Its intensity can be helpful to the analyst in understanding when it overlaps the analyst's identifications with internal objects or with the defenses and impulses of the analysand, while countertransference feelings frequently indicate whether the analysand is moving on, that is, if he is overcoming resistances or not. P. 23. Furthermore, in line with Freud's 1912 thinking, Racker, 1952-1951, asserts that the key to understanding our patients continues to be, as always, the capacity to pick up unconscious phenomena by means of the analyst's own unconscious. P. 19. The working through of what has been understood, through identification, Deutsch 1926, with the analysand's desires, defenses, and images, can suffer interference from the countertransferential reactions. 2 years later, in 1953, Racker wrote 4 papers on the subject. In the first, entitled On the Confusion Between Mania and Health, Racker maintained that a revival of infantile conflicts through transference, in an improved situation, that of analysis, requires the analyst, at least to a certain extent, to be free of anxiety. Thus, the analyst's own aspirations, like the desire to cure, comprehend, succeed, and be loved, are without compulsion. Then the inevitable and continual frustrations can be tolerated and worked through. To the extent that the analyst achieves it, he can help the patient to gain a larger degree of real independence, which is a better internal dependence. But if the analyst is not conscious of his countertransference reactions, he may expose the analysand once again to an archaic object that awakens his hostility, in spite of his having some understanding of what is happening in the patient. The analyst denies himself some understanding of the patient, and then of giving a useful interpretation. As an example, during her first analytic session, a woman patient talks about how hot it was and other matters which to the analyst seem insignificant. She says to the patient that very likely the patient dares not talk about herself. Although the analysand was indeed talking about herself, even when saying how hot it was, the interpretation was, in essence, correct, for it was directed to the central conflict of the moment. But it was badly formulated, and this was so partly because of the countertransference situation. For the analysts, "you dare not" was a criticism, and it sprang from the analyst's feeling of being frustrated in a desire. This desire must have been that the patient overcome her resistance. Racker, 1957-1953b, page 332. Furthermore, an analyst who lives in anxious dependence on his own internal objects, and therefore fearful of a healthy dependence, could unconsciously encourage the analysand, directly or indirectly, to act in an independent or instinctual manner and thus reinforce the pathological defense of acting out. Furthermore, an analyst who is subject to reaction formations could have difficulty helping the analysand to work through and overcome the neurotic dependence on the analyst. The analyst's neurosis could lead him to confuse hypomania for health, but if he controls a tendency to mania, e.g., the denial of both dependence and guilt feelings belong to its main characteristics, he shall also refrain from provoking analysands to make use of the same defense, whether or not the latter possess the tendency to flee to health. IVI, page 185. More generally, Racker believed it possible to connect the specific central neurotic position of an analysand with a specific countertransference reaction. The other 3 articles written in 1953 and presented to the APA were collected into one single published paper, The Meanings and Uses of Countertransference, and was his most complete essay on the subject. In this treatise, which included a review of what had been written in the file thus far, including Heimann's work, Racker maintained that the analyst's emotional response is closer to the patient's psychological state than is the analyst's conscious judgment of it. Then, he declared his agreement with Heimann about the following main points. 1. Countertransference reactions of great intensity, even pathological ones, should also serve as tools. 2. Countertransference is the expression of the analyst's identification with the internal objects of the analysand, as well as with his ID and ego, and may be used as such. 3. Countertransference reactions have specific characteristics, specific contents, anxieties, and mechanisms, from which we may draw conclusions about the specific character of the psychological happenings in the patient. Racker 1957-1953b, pages 305-6.